James, I have to admit, I think of myself as a student of history. I pride myself on knowing so much about Canada's history, and when I read your book, I was absolutely flabbergasted by the breadth and extent of it, but also it seemed like the relentless dark story that it tells that we haven't really dealt with as Canadians. When you were writing this, did you have a sense that there was something, that you were finding something else, that you didn't know, that there was something provocative, or there was an urgency to what you were uncovering in this academic field?
Well, I did spend almost 20 years working on this, so I guess the sense of urgency might have been bogged out a little bit with time.
Yeah, perhaps.
And kind of another aspect is that this is a synthesis. So I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of other people who've written a lot of monographs, a lot of specialized studies on different things. So I guess what I did was I put the wall together rather than building a new brick. And yeah, it's been pretty successful. Yeah, it's been pretty good.
Well, this idea that we have in Canada that our history's boring, Canada, we were always the place of good governance. We were all nice compared to those crazy Americans to the south of us. And yet, this book tells a much darker story. I was thinking of Mackenzie King, who said that, some countries are haunted by history. We're haunted by geography. Well, here we are in the land of Treaty 4, just near where Fort Qu'Appelle was, where the original treaty was signed. What does this land tell us? I mean, what happened here? Because it seems so pastoral, and yet you paint a picture of such hardness and suffering that, how is this geography? How did it affect where we are today?
Well, maybe it's the geography, like having that myth that we're dominated by geography. We've been able to ignore we as children of the settlers, we've been able to ignore the things, the terrible things that took place here. So yeah, the land has been sort of rebranded as an agricultural paradise, the breadbasket of the world. It's kind of ironic that it was founded on a bureaucratized famine.
Yeah, I was thinking, we always look over the border and say, well, the Americans, they did it wrong. They were more genocidal. There's the whole myth of the medicine line, that Sitting Bull crossed over into the Canadian prairie, and it was the magical place where there was, the
Safety, yeah.
the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and good governance, and yet, say what you want about the American experience, but at least they celebrate and they remember the First Nation heroes and the people who stood up. We all know the story. Every Canadian knows the story of Crazy Horse, but almost nobody knows the story of Poundmaker. And you tell the story of how there could have been a battle bigger than the Little Bighorn, and it was Poundmaker who was basically the peacemaker, and yet the Canadian response to imprison them, to hang the young starving people and force starving people to watch their young leaders be hung. I'd never heard that story before. What was it? What happened here with people like Poundmaker, and why was he trying to actually bring peace at a time when the communities had been lied to, and there was so much tension and suffering?
I think a lot of chiefs were trying to hold things together. They knew that things were out of hand with the Métis, as Louis Riel was carrying on his insurrection, and I think that a lot of the chiefs, like Poundmaker, Big Bear, were trying to stay close to the ideals of the treaty. Whether or not the Canadian government did that is another story.
So the treaty signed here for Treaty 4 at Qu'Appelle, there's commitments made. And it's at a time when people know that the buffalo is going to disappear, that the way of life is disappearing. What was the expectation for the tribes who came and sat down and said, yes, we will sign a treaty? And what was the promises made to them?
Well, Treaty 6 was where the sort of overlooked famine and pestilence clause was negotiated at Fort Carleton, actually, a couple years after the Qu'Appelle Treaty. And that was, the negotiations at Fort Carleton took place only a couple months after Custer met his demise at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So everyone was on their best behavior, if you will, was on their game with regard to negotiating Treaty 6. And the Cree negotiators were well aware that the Bison were on their way out. And they earnestly tried to get assistance in conversion to agriculture. My colleague Sarah Carter has written about the undermining of Aboriginal agriculture in her book Lost Harvests. And yeah, one of the things was the government committed itself to providing famine relief in a time of crisis. 2 years after the treaty, uh, the federal government essentially turned that responsibility or commitment on its head and used food as a weapon to subjugate the people of Western Saskatchewan.
You say in the book that John A. Macdonald is in the House of Commons assuring his fellow parliamentarians that they're not going to be feeding people who are starving. I read this and I see these echoes back to Ireland and the famine and the stories that my grandparents tell and the stories that are told in song, and I'm thinking, is this what happened in our own country, that it was the same tactics of that famine could be used to break a people, and what was the extent of this?
Well, Macdonald said in Parliament that he kept the people on the verge of quote unquote actual starvation. Wow. So they couldn't deal, like in Parliament, they couldn't deal with the political controversy of having thousands of people actually starve to death. But what they did was they kept them so hungry for so long that their immune systems were compromised and they were basically sitting ducks for tuberculosis to break out. And TB broke out community in, like a community-wide way very swiftly as that famine took hold.
Well, I think what was really disturbing for me in reading Clearing the Plains is that, again, in comparison to the Americans, where we saw, the genocidal assault against the Sioux, yeah, in the Dakotas and that, it was the bureaucratization of misery. It was the imposition of the Indian agent, of Indian affairs, the role of the federal government of denying food, of suppressing people, of breaking the treaty. It seems that we are still living the echoes of that today in terms of the federal government's relationship and the role of Indian affairs. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the wounds that were set out back in the 1870s, 1880s really haven't healed up. We still have a bureaucracy that controls vast portions of people's lives. People are going to Indian affairs for everything. So whether or not we get rid of the Indian Act is a political is a political decision, not for me to make. But we still got a bureaucracy that controls people's lives, like almost every aspect of people's lives.
Where I come from in Northern Ontario, it's Treaty 9, and I hear people say all the time, well, the treaty, get over it. It's something ancient. It was just signed over 100 years ago, and one of the commitments in Treaty 9 was actually stated was a commitment to education, because the Cree at that time knew their way of life was under threat, and they wanted their children educated, and what they got was the real horrors of the residential schools. We have communities where children don't have proper schools, where children are being educated on contaminated dump sites, and the communities still talk about that treaty like their grandparents signed it. To them, that treaty is still a real thing. What is it about the way First Nation communities view these treaties that to them it's still real and it's still an honored obligation, whereas to the rest of non-Native society, the treaty is like some kind of perfunctory thing we signed, hangover, let's get on and let's move on?
Yeah. Well, I think to First Nations people or First Nations leaders or the oral tradition, there was a knowledge that the white people, Canadian society was moving west and had to be dealt with, and this was a way to, even from the perspective of First Nations people, to set up a partnership. Okay, like mainstream Canadians, the Dominion of Canada would control 99.9% of the land in exchange for some pretty simple commitments that haven't really been followed through with for 120 years or more.
I really believe that Canada, our primary relationship is this relationship. The treaties that were signed here, the relationship, the commitments that were made, and it's still a relationship. And you hear people say, well, when's enough, and when are they going to get over it? It's like, you don't get over a relationship, you're part of a relationship. It's a good relationship, it's a bad relationship, it's a dysfunctional relationship. How do you see us moving forward? How does your book and the horror that it tells, how does it move us forward, and where do we need to go to make this relationship the relationship that it should be, not the relationship that it's been?
Well, I think a lot of us in mainstream society have sort of a partial view. We see the consequences. We see, the violence in communities, the poverty. We're not really thinking about what the antecedents were, like what the roots of that relationship or that dysfunctional relationship was. And in Western Canada, the treaty relationship went sour within a couple of years of it being signed. So we've got a legacy lasting more than a century I don't know, of just bad relations. Like it went south almost immediately.
But where are we today? Does it have to be that way, or because I still hear in the communities the word reconciliation, the belief that that relationship will get better, that the hand is outstretched. We don't see it with our federal government all right now, but uh,
Governments change.
governments change and people change. Do you
Yeah.
think that we're at a point in our history where Canadians maybe can learn and say, yeah, let's fix this?
Well, I think for us as Canadians, for Canada to become a mature country, I think we do need to sort of, yeah, we need to internalize as citizens what happened, how the relationship, turned sour, how it fell off the rails, or whatever analogy you want to use. So I think, hopefully, in a small way, my book is contributing to our collective knowledge. If it gets young people motivated politically, or even in an educational context, that's great. And the more we talk about it, the further along the path we're going to get.
Well, I think it's a fantastic work, and I think that this is a book that needs to be talked about. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, sir.